Welcome back. 70% of U.S. adults have had at least one dose of the COVID-19 vaccine. But the Delta variant is causing concern as the numbers are rapidly increasing. Now, over 100,000 new cases were recorded on Friday alone. Our US correspondent Simon Marks joins me now live from Washington, D.C. for more on this. So, Simon, of course, authorities are concerned because you're seeing so many more people being infected despite such a large number of people being vaccinated.
Yeah, including some people being infected who have already been vaccinated. Within the last hour, Shahan, we have learnt that among them is Senator Lindsey Graham, prominent Republican and a key figure in terms of foreign affairs up on Capitol Hill. He appears to have attended some kind of a party over the weekend that resulted in him and several others testing positive for COVID-19, even though he is one of the just under 50% of all Americans who have been vaccinated against COVID-19. But it's the unvaccinated that most worries the Biden administration and, frankly, embarrasses the United States. Because remember, this country has enough vaccine to inoculate its entire population. And yet, within the last few minutes, the president's top COVID-19 advisor has announced at the White House that there are still 90 million Americans who have not been vaccinated, and the White House is urging the recalcitrant, and they really are at this point recalcitrant because you can find the vaccine very easily from coast to coast, urging them to abandon their opposition to the COVID-19 jabs and to take their shot.
Yeah, so federal workers seem to have been targeted here, Simon, and I might have missed you talking about this because of audio issues. But just the way the president has approached federal workers, saying that some of them would have to submit whether or not they've been vaccinated. How's that going down? How's it being received?
Yeah, well, so this is a relatively new get tough approach by President Joe Biden, who was being faulted over the last few weeks by some of his own fellow Democrats for not doing enough to try and force the hand of those people in the US government's employment, and possibly soon also members of the US military, because the moment these COVID-19 vaccines that currently enjoy emergency authorization get full-time authorization, then, as Commander-in-Chief, Joe Biden can order members of the military to get vaccinated or lose their commissions within the military. And he's saying something very similar to federal government workers here. You will have to be vaccinated, or if you're unvaccinated, you will have to undergo regular, possibly weekly, testing for COVID-19 in order to keep your job. That is in keeping with the position that's being adopted by a number of private companies here. It is legal in the United States for private employers to insist that employees are vaccinated. You can then lose your job if you are unvaccinated unless you have some kind of religious or other medical reason for refusing to get the jab. That get tough approach by the government now, redolent of the fact that President Biden knows if he can't get those remaining 90 million Americans, or most of them, vaccinated, then this country will never achieve herd immunity and will constantly be at the risk of spreading any new variants that arrive on American shores.
So what's the problem? Is it hesitancy? Is it because people don't have access to the vaccines? What are Americans saying about why they're not getting vaccinated?
You know, there are some access issues, particularly in remote rural parts of the country, but for the most part of America, at this point, you'd really have to go out of your way to avoid encountering a needle. The vaccines are everywhere. This is deeply held vaccine skepticism that is being stoked in very large measure by misinformation on Twitter and by some very prominent voices in the conservative media, particularly a couple of commentators on the Fox News channel and some on-air personalities on other conservative-leaning media. There is some good news in all of this. Within the last hour or so, the US government has announced that in the last 7 days, 3 million Americans have received their first dose of vaccine. That is the highest 7-day total in over a month, and it suggests that word is now getting through to some of those people who remain unvaccinated that the Delta variant, more infectious than chickenpox, says the Centers for Disease Control, now poses a real risk. And so there is some evidence that that is beginning to move the needle, although it is very late in the day and there's a long way to go yet.
Simon, I'm also reading reports that the daily deaths have gone up by 33% and hospitalizations by 46%. That's very concerning for countries like ours, where we're struggling to vaccinate, 5 million people. We're still trying to get there. Yet in the US, you have millions vaccinated, but you're still seeing these large increases in infections, hospitalizations, and deaths.
Yeah, absolutely. Those tend to be focused in parts of the country with substantial numbers of unvaccinated people, although, as we've seen here, it is perfectly possible still for the fully vaccinated to test positive for the Delta variant of COVID-19, although the vaccines work, and they mean that if you are fully vaccinated but you get COVID-19, you are statistically very unlikely to end up in hospital or become a fatality. But if you look at the numbers, particularly in states like Florida, where there are substantial pockets of unvaccinated people, the number of infections and deaths is going through the roof. Intensive care units are filling up once again. And despite the fact that the Biden administration itself, back on July the 4th, held that party at the White House declaring independence from the pandemic, this country is still losing about 300 lives a day to COVID-19. That means every single week the country is losing roughly as many people as lost their lives in the Al-Qaeda attacks of September the 11th, 2001. And that remains a very sobering statistic here, even given the fact that nearly 50% of all Americans have been vaccinated.
Yeah, and then what about mask fatigue? We talk in South Africa about people having COVID fatigue, which is why social distancing doesn't happen, etc. But in the US, people were freely walking around without masks because they were fully vaccinated. And now authorities are saying when you're indoors, mask up.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair to the American people, they've been on the receiving end of yo-yoing advice from the Centers for Disease Control. I think most public health officials here would concede that the CDC made a dreadful mistake in May when, seemingly out of nowhere, they told fully vaccinated Americans to rip off their face masks. And indeed, the President of the United States, the First Lady of the United States, immediately discarded theirs. Now, fully vaccinated Americans are being told the Delta variant is so transmissible and so infectious that they should once again be wearing face masks. I can tell you that I spent the weekend in upstate New York. I happened to be driving past Tanglewood, that outdoor music venue in upstate New York. 4,000 or 5,000 people were descending on the venue to hear a concert by the cellist Yo-Yo Ma. There were hardly any of them wearing face masks, and that is in an area of the country where people have heard this advice. They understand that there's been a change in the guidance. In large parts of the country where people weren't wearing face masks in the first place, there is no chance whatsoever that they are going to start now putting them on. It's going to be an uphill battle for the Biden administration on the face mask issue from coast to coast.
Yeah, and I see Dr. Anthony Fauci is actually speaking to organizations saying that the U.S. will experience more pain and suffering in the future. So let's talk about the possibility then of certain states deciding to introduce a curfew or not allow bars, etc., to operate. Will that be considered?
I think it would be politically very, very difficult for states to go back in this country on the relaxation of restrictions that they've introduced. We can see that even here in Washington, D.C., where the face mask recommendations have now been embraced by the mayor of Washington, D.C., Muriel Bowser, a Democrat, prominent ally of President Joe Biden, but she's not imposing a requirement on people to wear face masks if they go inside restaurants. That for her was one step too far. I think the idea that we might find ourselves in a world where indoor dining, for example, is once again restricted, I mean, that seems like it would be a very high mountain for her and other elected officials across the country to climb. There is one caveat in all of this, though. As summer comes to an end here and we head towards winter, I've been talking to some public health officials who are very worried about what happens in the United States when COVID-19 and flu come together and respiratory diseases are widespread in the winter months. It could well be that we're facing a very, very difficult winter here that does lead some jurisdictions to look at the possibility of new restrictions, unpopular though they would be.
Yeah, the fight against this virus is far from over, certainly. Thanks so much for your time. We appreciate it. That, of course, is our US correspondent, Simon Marks, coming to us live from Washington, D.C.